Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington. The United States is not the only country going through a presidential election. On April 22nd, France will begin the first round of its presidential elections. And now joining us from New York City, where he's visiting, is Gérard Duménil. He's an economist and a former research director at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique. He's written many books. His latest, he co-authored, is The Crisis of Neoliberalism. Thanks for joining us, Gérard.
Thanks, hello.
And I should point out, you're normally based in Paris, but as I said, you're now visiting in New York. So give us a picture of who's running and how is the deepening economic crisis in Europe affecting the elections?
So now in the French election, we have the most important candidates. So he is a candidate of our present president, Nicolas Sarkozy, who is a candidate of the right, a main candidate of the right. And we have the other person, which is a candidate of the Socialist Party, which is a big, large, party of the left in France. And his name is François Hollande. Okay. But now, beside them, you have two other important candidates. One is a candidate of some form of more radical left. His name is Mélenchon. And the other one is the candidate of the extreme right, Marine Le Pen. She is a daughter of Le Pen, who was the founder of this Front National, which means National Front. Okay, so we have the two big candidates, right and left, that I mentioned first, and we have two other important candidates, which are to the extreme right, Le Pen, Marine Le Pen, a woman, and to the left, Mélenchon.
Well, let me ask you a question about this, yes? The Socialist Party. In Greece and some of the other European countries, what are called socialist parties have been quite fully participating in the austerity measures and sort of buying into this whole policy. And a lot of the left of those countries don't consider their socialist parties left. What is the state of or positioning of that party in France?
I use the categories left and right in the traditional sense. They are classified to the right and to the left. Okay, but many people believe, of course, that the Socialist Party is not really a left party. And that is one of the reasons of the success of the more radical party, which is the Front de Gauche. The left front, okay, and Mélenchon, okay. So Mélenchon has a much more radical attitude than the Socialist Party. Socialist Party, they govern France, in the recent decades, beginning with Mitterrand in '81, of course. And it's not clear that their policy was really a policy from the viewpoint of a genuine left, But, still they are different from the right. And on many social issues, political issues, and they are still different, Maybe for the economics, they're not going to do many things that they're really different from Nicolas Sarkozy. But there are also aspects, because in France now, there is a very central issue in the opinion, which is the issue of security, as we call it, which is a problem of immigration, the problem of delinquency, and this is a central political issue in France now. And our present president, Nicolas Sarkozy, tried to gain the votes of the extreme right, of Le Pen, by flattering the opinion, concerning this type of issue about immigrations. And many, even among popular classes like workers, they really listen to this and to what Marine Le Pen is saying, because they believe that they're losing their job because of the presence of immigrants. And there is a problem, in France in this respect. So concerning basic economic issues, it's not clear, that really the Socialist Party could do anything very different from the right, from Sarkozy. But on issue like this one, and maybe social issues, they are certainly different to a large extent.
Right. Now, the left party that you're saying is the next tier down. I understood that they were polling fairly well ahead of Le Pen. And surprisingly, the people, the way the
Not
reports
so
went.
much, Now what's happening is that the two parties, the two less important party, but still very important, in the poll they have about 15%. So now it's difficult to tell which one will be the third one in the election, because both of them have about 15%. And the same situation, at least 1 week ago, the same was true of Hollande, Socialist Party, and Sarkozy, the UMP, because they were close to 27% each. Okay. But in the recent days, I read it today on my computer. Actually, it seems that Sarkozy is diminishing and Hollande is progressing. In the last few days, Sarkozy apparently, lost 2 percentage points and Hollande gained.
Now,
So it's very balanced. It's very balanced. You have two big candidates about the same percentage, and the two more extreme, candidates about the same percentage too.
Now, the deepening economic crisis in the Eurozone, and a lot of people have placed a lot of the blame, at least, not just on the big banks, but particularly on German banks and the German elite. And is there any sense that France might resist some of these policies if the Socialist Party is elected, or even Sarkozy? I see reports, even he's talking about trying to save French social programs and such.
Yeah, but if you look at the program, for example, it's very interesting to see that both candidates say we have to control finance. Okay, we have to limit big upper incomes. We have to increase the taxation of very high incomes. But you have to be very careful, because it's not clear that you can take all that seriously. Okay. They are blaming the crisis on the banks, you see, but what are they really going to do? We have absolutely no idea. For example, Hollande has a kind of policy which will be some kind of Glass-Steagall Act, separating the activities of banks. Or they are also Socialist parties in favor of the Tobin tax. What they will do will probably be very different. But you see, the crisis has a very big impact on politics in France. It's not so much a relationship to Germany, but it's mostly this type of effect. As I said earlier, workers are losing their jobs. Okay, rate of unemployment is more than 10%, and the situation is not improving. And now several countries in Europe are entering into a new recession. Okay, like Greece, like Spain, and very probably, very likely, the same thing will happen very soon in France, because it's linked to the politics of austerity. They are just cutting expenses. And so people are very concerned. But this type of feeling, because people are afraid for their job, to lose their job, but this type of feeling can stimulate people to the right, or can stimulate people to the extreme, to the left, or to the extreme right. Okay, so the effect is politically very, very complex. For example, the Marine Le Pen from the extreme right, she has a very, very strong economic program with protectionism, with the control of financial interest. And if you listen to her, you could have the feeling that you are listening to a candidate from the extreme left. So the situation is confused, and quite a number of workers in France, identified to actually Le Pen, to the extreme right. Unfortunately, we have this candidate Mélenchon and the Front de Gauche now, which is developing some kind of more radical policy than the Socialist Party. So now, in the recent weeks, in recent months, people move to vote to the candidate of the extreme. Extreme is exaggerated, I should say a more radical left, or maybe a more real left than the Socialist Party.
Right. Now, a lot of analysts have said that part of this crisis in Europe is the banks, the financial elite, taking advantage of the crisis to undo the social safety net, undo the European welfare state, if you will. As that starts to proceed in France, what's the state of the mass movement in terms of mobilizing outside of these electoral politics?
But in France, people are used to the system of a social protection. Okay, we have a rather sophisticated system with health insurance, okay, public health insurance, retirement, okay, and unemployment benefits, and this sort of thing. In France, people are really used to that, so it's very difficult for a government like Sarkozy, okay, to cut these expenses. Sarkozy is really the president of the rich. I have friends who are people I know who are sociologists. They wrote a very famous, very successful book whose title is "The President of the Rich." Okay, and this is absolutely true. Okay, so this government is doing everything to cut social expenses, to cut social programs, but there is a lot of resistance. What they do is that they are cutting slowly, slowly, and slowly. Okay, you take a drug for some reason, you discover that now they found that this drug is not efficient, so they will not reimburse this drug in the insurance system. In hospital, the situation is deteriorating a lot. If you speak with medical doctors, okay, even people high in the hierarchy, they will complain, that they cannot work. Why? Because they are constantly reforming, constantly cutting, expenses and so on. So these people are working in conditions which are constantly deteriorating. So it's not that they are really getting rid of the system of social protection in France because people would be in the street. It's just a constant pressure, constantly cutting, constantly creating more difficult situation.
And I know this is a big topic, but just as quickly as we can, we don't have too much time. How is the current crisis in the Eurozone, quote unquote, managed? In other words, can they keep finding ways to paper over the crisis? Or is there any imminent possibility of this thing really unraveling?
Now in the world, in the US and in Europe, the crisis entered into a second phase. Okay, so the second phase is first. This was the crisis of the financial system, and it developed at the end of 2008 into a big recession. Okay, now the crisis is the crisis of a government, the crisis of sovereign debts. Okay. And this is true in the United States, and this is also true in Europe. But in the United States, the policy of the Federal Reserve was very strong, okay, with quantitative easing. They are financing the government. In Europe, there are a lot more resistance. And in Europe, because of the diversity of countries, there are international pressure, for example, coming from Germany, because Germany is not growing better than France, contrary to what you can read in the press. But, they have less deficit of the government. And before the crisis, before 2007, they cut social expenses tremendously. They diminish lower wages. The lower fraction of wages, they diminish considerably. So, in this sense, maybe Germany is doing better, except that the cost for popular classes has been huge. So now in France, we have exactly this situation, which is, okay, we should imitate Germany. Okay, and because Germany did better, this means what? Cut social expenses, diminish lower wages. Okay, so that's the situation. The problem is the central bank. The central bank in Europe is not the Federal Reserve. Okay, the Federal Reserve, I believe, is more committed to the interests of the country, and now they are supporting the U.S. economy very strongly because you will also have elections. Okay, so I believe personally, that they are taking care of the economy. They try to postpone, to delay the coming recession.
At least until after November elections, then we'll see.
Exactly. That's what I am saying now, but maybe you know better than me about that. But in France, in Europe, we don't have this type of situation now. So yes, the problem is the accumulation of debt from governments and how to manage that. In Europe, it's certainly, you see, let me tell you something, my feeling personally. In the United States, I'm not saying that the situation is nice at all, okay? But, there is a very strong national factor in the sense that there is a very strong national feeling of the country as being a powerful country in the world. If you go to Europe, okay, you don't have this feeling because you have a diversity of countries. There is no national feeling at all, okay? And I think that this political or national or nationalist, if you want, or political factor is not playing at all exactly in the same manner and in Europe and in the United States. And this is really a huge problem in Europe.
Which means all the various elites can't get together even to save themselves.
Exactly. You see, what's happening is that Germany is looking down to other countries, to Greece, while what were these guys doing? They were spending money without care and so on.
Yeah, they can't vote in the German elections, so what the hell?
So you see, the problem was the same way with country like Spain. But this situation is rather complex. We would have to analyze that country after country. Okay? Well, because it's not the same situation in every country.
Well, we'll come back and talk more after April 22nd, and we'll come back again to the situation in France.
Okay.
Thanks very much for joining us, Gérard.
Okay, thanks to you. It was a pleasure for me.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.